So to start us off, what is a historic resource survey? It is a study that's designed to identify and evaluate properties in an area, such as a community, a rural area, a neighborhood, to determine whether they may be of historic, architectural, archaeological, engineering, or cultural significance. A historic resources survey includes field survey work, where physical search and recordation occurs on the ground, but there's also planning and background work, research that goes on before the field survey work would begin. And the survey work results usually in inventories or National Register nomination forms even. Some of you may be familiar with this form on the slide here, the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties form. These are where the information gets recorded on after the survey. These forms are used to help evaluate to determine if the resource meets any of the defined criteria of historical, architectural, archaeological, or cultural significance. And so what are historic resources? Well, the National Historic Preservation Act defines them as any prehistoric or historic district, site, building, structure, or object included in or eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. Historic preservation programs deal with the full range of properties that are significant in American history, in prehistory and architecture. They'll look at engineering, again, and the culture. And they will include those properties that are significant. Maybe they're significant to the whole nation, maybe they're significant to the state or a region, or just have local significance. It's important to survey an area's historic resources because it tells us where historic properties are so that their protection and improvement can be considered in planning new projects and use of the land. It's also important to identify these resources because of the value they have to a community or a neighborhood or a culture, and they should be retained as functional parts of our modern life. The historic resources in an area can give it a special character. It also helps to give it cultural depth. Not only that, but they also represent an investment of time and energy, of raw materials. And so there's a green environmental benefit as well when we can identify and save those historic resources. Additionally, some historic resources even contain information whose study can provide unique insights into the past and can help answer broader questions about our history. And finally, surveys can be beneficial by increasing public understanding of and interest in an area's history and historic properties. And this can be accomplished through publications or other use of the information from the survey itself. So there are really two types of surveys. There's a reconnaissance survey, which is like a once-over light inspection that provides a general idea of the kinds of historic properties that may be present. And perhaps there might be some documentation of a few resources in more detail. But this type of survey does not necessarily identify all the resources within a study area. Sometimes these are also referred to as windshield surveys. And then there's the intensive level survey where the entire study area is inspected closely, and it can be assumed that all the historic properties within that study area have been identified. There's also different kinds of surveys. So there could be like a predictive survey that are usually applied to like a large area, such as a rural area, in which predictions are made about where historic properties of different kinds will be found based on background research. And then these predictions are tested through the inspection of sample blocks or tracts of land. There's also like a thematic survey that could be conducted. So you could just be trying to identify all the historic rural schoolhouses, for example, in a survey area. And then of course, there's other kinds of surveys as well. And you can combine these different kinds into different ways, depending upon what your purpose of your survey is. Which brings me to the next slide, which is planning your survey work. So identifying the purpose is the first step in the planning process. One of the main purposes, if not the sole, is obviously to be able to, complete and fully document all the historic properties that are in that study area. But it's also important to know you don't have to have all the resources identified and documented in order to have a survey be useful. If background knowledge of a community's history suggests that important historic properties may be concentrated in particular areas, for example, it may be more cost effective to focus your survey in that area and have a lower priority in an area that you know doesn't have as many historic resources. Alternatively, if not much is known about a community's historic resources, it may be appropriate to concentrate initially on background research and broad-scale reconnaissance to obtain an initial idea of the community's resource base before designing more intensive surveys. And then development pressure or community interest in preserving and investing in properties can also drive survey work as well. Historic contexts are also important. They're an influential factor in defining the structure of a survey. A historic context is a broad pattern of historical development in a community or in a region that may be represented by historic resources. And then you want to identify in your planning what your survey goals are, and those are usually based off of your historic contexts. And then from there, you can achieve your goals by prioritizing and basing those factors on such things as, you know, what's already been conducted in the area, what's the available funding, are there other survey opportunities to consider as well. And then you also want to plan how your data is going to be stored and organized and used before you go out, so that you know what, if you're doing like an inventory or survey for the state, you want to make sure you're capturing all the information that's required and requested on the forms that they need. And then you can also plan to get the public involved in the survey. You might include neighborhood meetings, newspaper articles, discussions at things like this. And then that community enthusiasm can help generate possibly some volunteer support during the survey itself with you know, research or even doing some of the field survey work as well. Then once you have the survey, the next step is actually start doing or once you have the survey plan, the next step is to actually start the survey work. And so one of the first steps is to do your background and archival research so you can develop a good understanding of the area's history. It's important to have this information. You don't want to miss any significant properties or evaluate them incorrectly. You could also just not even know what it is that you're looking at without this background. So you want to look not only at published local histories, but you also are going to want to look at, again, your primary data as well. And then this research can continue as you move into the next step of field survey, because as you're out in the field, you can certainly come across other questions while you're out there that need to go back and do some additional background research on. Then during the field survey work, surveyors are making notes on the buildings, the structures, the landscape characteristics. They're taking photographs. The records that are taken on the structures are usually abbreviated, and they're just, you know, jotting down and making sure they've got all the information they need, so that when they go back and do the final part, recording the information in the inventory forms or nomination forms, that they have all that information gathered and are able to do the recording process. So how do we use this information in planning? There's a few different ways that survey information can be integrated into a planning department. For example, survey data can assist with the development of comprehensive and preservation plans. Comprehensive plans are used to guide growth and development, while preservation plans are used to plan for the continued identification and evaluation of historic properties and for the protection and enhancement. A preservation plan will relate the preservation goals to the comprehensive plan, so they you have your broader comprehensive plan and then some more specialized plans, such as your preservation plan. Additionally, surveys can help demonstrate to local lawmakers that there's a need to develop or refine ordinances that better protect the historic resources. You can also utilize surveys to help target administration of financial incentive programs by identifying the specific historic properties and the owners that might be offered such incentives. You can also use the survey work to help in managing the destruction of historic properties. I mean, we know that historic properties cannot always be saved, even with the best of preservation programs. And so when a property, has to give way to development or from natural processes of erosion or decay, we could look to finding ways to avoid that complete loss. So can we relocate this resource? Can we salvage the materials? Or can we get in there and do some updated recordation of the property or more detailed recordation prior to its demolition? And without that survey data, we won't always know that that resource has significance in the historic prior to its demolition. And then finally, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires that federal agencies take into account the effects of their undertakings on historic properties. So Section 106, it requires review of a wide range of activities. Local survey data can then be used to ensure that a federal agency or even a local or state agency that's getting federal funding or permitting, that their plans to undertake, assist, or permit a project, they're aware that the historic properties, where they are or where they are not, in the vicinity of that project, so they can be taken into account. So the county has conducted architectural survey work in the past. Surveys were completed countywide between 1978 and 1980, in which 575 sites were inventory or were surveyed during that period. And then survey work began again in 1991 with the goals of completing an intensive level architectural survey of 2 planning regions a year over a 4-year period. That survey identified over 5,000 sites and resulted in the completion of 491 inventory forms. Since that time, the county hasn't done any comprehensive survey work at that scale. However, I'm happy to say the county is now focused again on completing survey work, and we are focusing this time on our African American resources throughout the county. And we have partnered with Arch to complete this countywide historic context development, as well as surveying of the African American resources. It's going to be a project that's going to take several years, a phased project as we see grant funding. And we are happy to say that we have the first phase partially funded. This one was also in partnership with Catoctin Furnace Historical Society, and we are starting to do that work in the northern part of Frederick County. This area was not as surveyed as it had been, as other parts of the county had been surveyed in these past survey work, and so we wanted to focus our this round of survey work starting up there. And so I know Elizabeth Comer, who is here with Catoctin Furnace, is going to provide an update and information on this phase of the project. Catoctin Furnace, they were the lead applicant on this grant application. And again, we're just so happy and thankful to have Arch and Catoctin Furnace partnering with us on this phase of the work. And so I will stop there, and I will turn my computer over to, I guess, you, Carrie, if I can figure it out.
Amanda, if you can stop your screen share. There we go. Very nice. Before Elizabeth enters the room, we do have a couple of questions that are more survey specific, Amanda. So I don't know if we may want to see if you might want to address them. Elizabeth may want to address them further at the end of her presentation, where again, she'll be talking about the Northern Frederick County project that you mentioned. But, and I know this isn't quite your world, you know, when we're dealing with public history, we have lots of related fields. And I know that you aren't at this, again, this may not be from your particular part of the world, but can you think, or how would you advise docents, Amanda, who wanted to utilize, or how they could utilize the results of survey work in what they do in regards to giving tours and public programming?
I guess I would first suggest that they maybe they can contact me for sure. We have survey files in our department that they can reach out to find out information if if there's like a historic house or something of that nature that might relate to the museum's purpose. They could reach out to me, and I can give them the information that we might have. Of course, MHT maintains a database as well of all the recorded sites, architectural sites that are accessible by the public.
And of course, and you may have already started to say this or had said this earlier, the survey forms do go up at the Maryland in Maryland Historical Trust and are accessible and are used a lot by genealogists and by many different types of people doing research. It's not always just people putting through highways. There are many reasons to use survey forms. I'm always pushing out to genealogists to use survey forms. And I know the previous librarian at the Maryland Historical Trust used to say, we have no genealogy material here, because she was thinking of it from the more traditional sense. But definitely survey forms, as you're saying, are packed full of information. And I think now there's a question from Wendy, and I believe that there had been discussion of this earlier under the previous county planner, but I don't know if it has come to any fruition or if it's still under discussion. But Wendy was saying the completed inventory forms are fascinating to look at online, which is true. Is there any effort to have a Google map with all such documented properties, locations in Frederick County pinned so that the general public can use the Google Maps easily to know which properties are in different parts of the county? When you click on a specific pin, it could take you to the associated form. I think you kind of get the idea. And of course, the concern would be the privacy of owners as well. But has anything like this ever been discussed, or at least recently discussed, in regards to survey properties in the county?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. That hasn't come up as at least new conversation, but that's a great idea. I know, the county has a variety of online mapping, and right now you can go and do like a specific property search, and it will tell you what historic resources may be in the immediate surrounding area of that specific property. But right now there's no way to get that information. I would just direct everybody to MHT's website, which doesn't interface with Google, but that's where it is right now.
Right, and within that, you can, as Marilyn was saying, you can use Medusa to show exactly where the properties are. So you've got to work for it a little more.
Yeah.
But again, it is a concern because these are predominantly private homes. I know Landmarks has been trying to have a similar discussion with plaqued properties, but those are in a slightly different situation. I guess that's all that I have at this moment in time. We will have more time for questions in the immediate future.
And Mary, I might just add to that one question about how docents can work. As I've getting more and more into this position and coming across researching my own, other properties that have come up looking to get designated, there are times where there are research questions about the property that are on the form. And so I will be reaching out maybe to a museum or a historical society to help make some more connections. So on kind of like on a flip side, I guess, of me reaching out to them, I see more of that happening in the future too.
Well, and it does go both ways, obviously, as you're saying. And I know you alluded to this earlier, but just for clarification, because there are survey forms, and the survey forms, as you were saying, there's different levels of survey depending on funding and need and time and many things. And that there are some survey work that has been done where the forms haven't necessarily been prepared or aren't as deep, but you do have the research notes for the previous planner.
Yes. Oh, yes. We have lots of great research notes. And I know that, when she was doing the survey work and she was focusing on accomplishing a certain amount of inventory forms that got recorded, since that time, I think a lot of those other sites that she had found, those over 5,000, have also been slowly being recorded, as well as, Section 106 projects and things like that come along, and other reasons as well.
Yeah, so you could have a surveyor do work at a particular level, and then again, Section 106 kicks in and someone has to come through and make it a deeper form, because surveyors, I did survey work for Delaware, which calling it windshield wasn't even that deep necessarily. and then Baltimore City. I know one of the reasons I'm an archivist is because I was a very bad architectural historian. I'm a much better librarian and much better archivist, but it does give me the knowledge of what goes on, which we like to think is one of the strengths of the Maryland Room, particularly also with Marilyn, who's on here, who is our superb property researcher, that we have an understanding of the process. But, and I don't forget where I was going with this. Oh, that sometimes survey work it's very much controlled by funding. And so a surveyor may want to do a much deeper form and do much deeper documentation and do all that research, but they can't. And even sometimes Section 106 people have that same experience where there's only so much funding going to that.
Right.
And actually, Carrie Albee is with us, who is doing survey work and overseeing survey work for the city. We'll be talking to Carrie later. But Carrie, do you have any comments relating to what we've talked about so far? And unmute yourself, Carrie.
We've probably said that enough times today. Nothing specific. I wasn't sure what you might like to see, so I did pull up a few things on my computer to sort of illustrate what we've been doing in Frederick, and in particular, some of the focus on African-American sites within the city of Frederick. So I defer to you, Mary, on what you might want me to weigh in on.
Okay, yeah, so after Liz presents, then when we get to the discussion, we'll pull in Carrie in that regards. I was just wondering if you want to, at this point in time, address Carrie at all, since you've been doing this work for many years, the problem with sometimes you only have so much money and so much time and can only do work at a certain level. And then you spend the rest of your career feeling bad that, oh, I didn't do more for that property.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, you've pretty much just described my entire career right there. And I did that, my ears did perk up when I heard Amanda talking about the limitations on survey work. You know, as a consultant, you get to do a lot of cool stuff, but because you're actually in a for-profit environment where you have a boss that's trying to make money, there are a lot of factors that go into the work that we do that can sometimes come in conflict with our natural desire to research and to document. So I think one of the major challenges that I have faced as a consultant, and I know others of you have as well, is that you're only being paid a certain amount to do a certain scope of activities, right? And that's not always evident to the people that come behind you and look at the work that you've done. So as I've gotten older and more experienced in my career, I've been a lot kinder to people that have gone before me, you know, about the level of documentation that you might encounter. You know, sometimes you pick up a survey form and you think, well, this is ridiculous. This is only a paragraph. And, you know, I could have done better than this, yada, yada, yada. Well, that person may have wanted to do more, but that was all they really had the ability to do in that context. And every little bit helps. So that's one limitation. I think the other limitation is that you have paying clients that have agendas. And that agenda is not always a preservation agenda. And sadly, I would say more often than not, in the consulting environment, it's not a preservation agenda. So yeah, I used to work for a company that shall remain nameless, where I was constantly being told by engineers that you are not a resource advocate. That is not your job. And I would always say to myself, you don't know our field very well, do you? Because that, you know, that's why architectural historians get into the field. There's always going to be a preservation advocacy piece of how I practice. Fortunately, my current employer, Graham Pape, is very in line with that philosophy. It's the benefits of a small business. But sometimes you have a client that flat out says, okay, we're hiring you to do this. I want you to find that this property is not historically significant. And, you know, we have to have that conversation about, you know, if you're hiring us to conduct an objective third-party review of something like that, then we're going to tell you what we legitimately think, and it may not be consistent with what you want. So those are kind of, I would just point out the two challenges that one should keep in mind when looking at existing documentation that is pulled together. Mary, does that speak to any of the topics you were hoping?
That is perfect. Yes, because since I've done survey work and of various types, I do spend a fair amount of time explaining to patrons who are using the form why there's only this much information. And we certainly see plenty of people, consultants in the Maryland room, who come in and say, I'm just here to look at the city directories. I don't have time to do a title search. My plane leaves in 2 hours. And it's the nature of the business.
Well, and I would say the big joke is always the rabbit hole. You know, when you're a historian, when you're a docent, you know, when you're an architectural historian, when you tell your colleague or your peer that you fell into the rabbit hole last night and went down a research, avenue that you're not going to be able to bill the client for, but you just did it because it was interesting and you wanted to know, that's the trick. Watch out for the rabbit holes.
Yeah, and it's very true too. And if you look at, professional genealogists, I'm only paid for 2 hours. Don't show me that book because I can't look at it. Okay. I think right now we are going to segue into Elizabeth Comer. Carrie will make sure that Elizabeth can share the screen, and the other Carrie, and then Carrie and Amanda, we will be back with you shortly. So thank you so much, Amanda.
Hello.
And I'm going to say Elizabeth Comer, who needs no introduction. Here is her video.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm Elizabeth Anderson Comer, and I'd like to share with you our project called the Northern Frederick County Cultural Resource Survey. It's funded by the Maryland Historical Trust, part of a 2020 MHT non-capital grant. The Northern Frederick County Cultural Resource Survey is aimed at recording heretofore unknown or unrecognized African-American architectural resources in the northern part of Frederick County. We've defined the northern part of Frederick County by the Pennsylvania line to the north, the Monocacy River to the east, the mountain lands and basically to the west, and to the south, the boundaries of both the Criggerstown and Catoctin election districts, and that is basically just south of Lewistown. So the towns within the Northern Frederick County study area include Emmitsburg, Thurmont, it includes Lewistown, Catoctin Furnace, and it takes in also what we call the greater furnace lands. And these are the lands that you can see on these two maps are outlined in sort of bright purple. The greater furnace lands are up to or a little more than 11,000 acres. And this land area waxed and waned through the 18th and 19th century, but basically it is the area that is around Catoctin Furnace, taking in the mountain to the west, and then also to the east, what we call the agrarian lands. And you can see those outlined in the map in these smaller pieces of purple, basically. Those are Windy Hill and Springfield and Auburn. These were the agrarian lands that surrounded the mansions that the furnace owners built. And it was in these lands that enslaved Africans and freed African Americans worked, in addition to working at Catoctin Furnace. These maps I'm showing you the 1858 Isaac Bond map, which shows you the 5 election districts that we have selected as part of the North County research area. And then the map on the right is a modern USGS quad, but it shows you the modern roads like Route 15, and of course towns and streams. So that is our study area. So one of the things that the research project is really delving into are the Moravian diaries. And just a little bit of background on this. When my mother was writing her a definitive history of Catoctin Furnace, she realized that there might be something in the Moravian diaries. So she traveled to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and worked with a researcher there who could read Old German. And together they found 2 entries that specifically mentioned Catoctin furnace and the African American population. When I reread those very passages, I realized that this was nor digitized. So the only way to get at this information is in the Bethlehem Moravian archives and in the mind and eyes of someone who reads Old German. So when I started working with the Moravian archives in January of 2021, they were able to help me identify a gentleman who was coming off a project of transcribing 1,000 pages of diaries for another part of the country. And I've been working with him since then. He transcribes and he looks for keywords in the diaries that we have agreed upon each week. And then we spend several hours every weekend going over his findings and then planning and plotting what the next part of his research will be. What I've shared with you on the screen right now are just 3 very short, tantalizing excerpts from the 1760 and 1799 diaries. They are they talk a great deal about the Black population in Northern Frederick County, not just at Catoctin Furnace, but in various farms and industries that surrounded Graceham, which is where the Moravian Church was established. So I think it's very interesting to read these. They talk about the children being baptized, in this case at the request of Mrs. Biggs, because the English preacher, who would be the priest from All Saints in Frederick, couldn't come, so they had the Moravians baptize the children. And then another Negro married couple's daughter, Hannah, was baptized. And the Black population really wanted to go to church. They were very clear that they wanted to be part of this community. And so this particular Moravian brother in 1799, Brother Schlegel, said, okay, I will have a service for you every 2 weeks. Here he says 4 weeks, but eventually he agreed to have a service every 2 weeks. And so throughout the diaries, we're seeing this continual interaction between the Moravians and the African-American population. What this research is also telling us are specifically where some of the African-Americans were living. We have names, of course, we have baptism, marriages, funerals, all kinds of data that's coming out of these very rich and heretofore unresearched archives. So Rick and Marilyn Smith are also a huge part of this team. They have taken on the Herculean task of going through the federal census beginning in 1790 and recording the number of free Black heads of household, the number of persons in the free Black households, the number of free Black servants, and then, of course, the total number of free Blacks. The reason we're concentrating on the free Blacks is because obviously we're looking for places where they would have been living. We have a very good idea, and we will be, of course, be also recording where the enslaved were living. But the free Blacks are critical to knowing specific structures that we can now record that were the homes or the businesses, the farms, the dwelling places of these free Black citizens of Northern Frederick County starting in the 1790s. So one of the things that jumps right out in this federal census household data is that you can see that the number of free Blacks and of course the number of servants, the numbers for every category steadily rise. in the 19th century. And that is a pattern that we would have expected and we do see in the census records. One of the ways that we are going to be able to actually hone in on specific structures in which African Americans live is through this very detailed map research. So what you see here are two town maps, Criggerstown and Graceham. And what our GIS specialist has done is he superimposed the historic atlases with the maps that show where the structures are today. So we're able to actually go to these particular locations where a historic structure is extant. And if we know that an African-American family lived there or owned that property, then that will of course be one of the properties that we'll be recording within the North County Cultural Resource African-American Architectural Survey. So you may wonder, how do we record this? What is the mechanism? They're known as MIHP forms, which stands for Maryland Inventory of Historic Places. And these are very specific forms that the Maryland Historical Trust uses to record historic properties. And I've shared with you one here that we, my company, completed for a resource in Prince George's County. You can see that it's very detailed map research, photographs of the interior, if possible, and certainly the exterior of the property. It's a deep dive into not just the architectural resources of this particular property, but also the who, what, when, where, and how. When it was built, if possible, who lived in it, a title search, of course, a description, and so forth. So it is a way to capture this data and put it into the database that the Maryland Historical Trust has for all of historic resources in the entire state of Maryland. And that will be the final, one of the final products of this survey. The schedule is, we're underway already. We are collecting and processing the data from the Moravian archives. It's obviously a multi-month undertaking. We're also collecting and processing data from the United States Census, from newspapers, broadsides, probate, land records, oral histories. And, you know, we have a number of people working on this, Rick and Marilyn Smith, Edward Quinter. We have several interns from the University of Maryland, from Johns Hopkins University, and from the University of Oklahoma working on this. So we have quite a team that we've put together. We're going to be developing the comprehensive historic context report that will put all of this information into a context in which we can interpret and understand these structures. And that will begin in May. It must wait until we have the raw data, both from the Moravian diaries and from the other documentary resources. And then in the fall of 2021, we'll be actually going through Frederick County, Northern Frederick County, and finding these specific dwellings that we have been researching and actually recording them architecturally. We'll be completing the survey report in February of 2022, and then submitting approximately 25 MIHP forms, first in draft, and then in final form in May 2022. So it's a very exciting year and a half long project that we're undertaking. One of the things that is related in a way to understanding the African-American experience in Northern Frederick County is the disease process and pandemic process that took place. One of the things that the Moravian Archives contains is very detailed information that concerns health. And of course, health as it was ministering to the sick, but also, of course, in many cases, ministering to the bereaved. What we are finding is that there was a great deal, unfortunately, of disease and pandemic. And so we are looking at that information, working with an epidemiologist at the Smithsonian, and also looking at the effect of drought or excessive rain or other crop failures on the health of the individuals that we can see in the diaries. And you can see here that just trust me, 1803 was not a good year. There was 6 months of drought, no vegetables. The mills didn't have enough water to operate, but also there was this putrid fever, which was just, it's typhus. One of our researchers has been able to sort of drill down to what was the disease called putrid fever in the early 1800s, and it was typhus. Just terrible pandemic. In 1800, not a good year either. There was a malignant bilious fever, and between March and September, 30 people in the neighborhood died. Just a very large number for just the neighborhood around Graceham. And within the congregation itself, 8 people died just in those few months. So again, a terrible year. So these are just some of the diseases and pandemic information that we're gathering, because it really is part and parcel of what life was like, and is really helping us understand more about this population and the way in which they had to live. So one of the things that I was hoping to share with you today is how can you help, but then how can we help you? Because the whole point of this research is to inform the Arch context and the Arch interpretation of their new center here in Frederick. And the northern part of the county has heretofore been very little studied for African-American resources. So we're thrilled to be able to undertake this research with Arch and with Frederick County Planning and Amanda Whitmore's office. So we're asking you to share any information you may have about ancestors and family living or visiting in the North County area. It includes oral histories or any kind of documentation, sharing any photos of homes, gatherings, reunions, churches, weddings, funerals, anything like that in the North County area. Sharing any information about Black-owned farms or homes or businesses in the area. And then very importantly, even if your family is not from the North County, please know that this is just the first of what is planned to be surveys of African-American resources throughout Frederick County. So stay tuned for the next one. And so we're hoping to prepare data and networking for the next sector of Frederick County that will undertake a comprehensive African-American cultural resources survey, and in partnership with a historical society like the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society, who's spearheading this research for the North County, but it would be another organization somewhere else in Frederick County. So our team is just amazing, and we want to make sure we thank Arch for teaming with us and allowing us, frankly, to undertake this incredibly important and valuable work. Frederick County Planning and Amanda Whitmore, the Moravian Archives, the Maryland Historical Trust for the funding. I have to thank my firm, EAC Archaeology, because they volunteer an enormous amount of effort to do mapping and historical research and just lots and lots and lots of resources. And thank you to Cunningham Falls State Park, the National Park Service, Catoctin Mountain Park, Harvard University's Reich Lab, the Smithsonian, and then Frederick Roots, Rick Smith, and the frederickRoots.com, the African American Genealogy Group of Frederick County, and of course, the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society. So that is our project. And again, we are thrilled to be doing this. We welcome, we encourage, we want any and all collaboration from the community to find what we might be having trouble finding or having trouble understanding. Please join in and help us tell the complete story and recover the identity of the African American population in Northern Frederick County. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for putting that together. For the sake of full disclosure and mostly to warn the presenters here who think they're doing something they may not be doing in the near future, it's Master Docent, so we're running late. It's just the nature of Master Docent. One would think in this virtual environment we could contain ourselves more, but we cannot. Thankfully, Barry, who is one of our next presenters, is willing to sit out and wait for a little bit longer. So first, Elizabeth, are there any questions for Elizabeth relating to what she talked about North County Survey, or any questions generally continue about survey work, or again about the work in North County, of which I, for one, am very excited about? All right, you have plenty of time because Elizabeth will stay with us. Okay, Elizabeth, we have a question from Elizabeth, or Liz, we have a question from Liz. How will survey results be incorporated in programs and exhibits at Catoctin Furnace Historical Society?
Well, that's a great question. And what we're planning is that the information that will come out of this survey that will inform our understanding of the African-American experience in the northern part of the county will frankly swirl around in a very profound way, Catoctin Furnace. And I say that because throughout our research, and this has been actually contained as well within the Moravian archives, as if we didn't know it from the documentary research, the Johnsons had the greatest number of enslaved in all of Northern Frederick County. So the experience and the interpretation of Catoctin Furnace cannot be made without this larger context. So this is the perfect sort of marriage of a larger cultural landscape and research for all of Northern Frederick County, but it very much swirls around and will be part of the exhibits at Catoctin Furnace. One of the things that has happened in the Moravian archives, that just happened a few minutes ago, is that we appear to have identified our severely crippled elderly gentleman. So this is sort of this melding of the forensic data, the documentary data, and it's frankly very, very, very exciting. So the answer is yes, a great deal of this information will be utilized within the Catoctin Furnace interpretive program. But obviously the not to use the word, but the overarching goal here is to help arch with the context for the county, and particularly, of course, in our case, focused on the North County.
Elizabeth, another question that someone had recently been speaking to me about, and not to make any generalizations or not to offend anyone who lives in the north part of the county, I think it's common knowledge that that hasn't always necessarily been welcoming to our African-American citizens. And as speaking as someone who has had, while doing survey work, had someone pull a gun on them to get off their land, is there concern about how when doing field survey work, how it may be accepted by some aspects of the Northern County population? Again, not to put all the Northern County population into a bucket.
Well, I'm from North County, so I feel like I have sort of a leg up, if you will. I have never actually been asked to leave a property. I, try to educate whoever owns the property or is living there about why this is important. There's a way to sort of segue into what's important to them, and why this is important in sort of a larger context. I do know what you mean. One does have to be careful, and property rights, of course, are paramount, and we take that into consideration whenever we do survey work. But honestly, somebody always knows somebody who knows somebody who's related to somebody. And there's generally a way to pick up the phone or contact a neighbor or get at the information that one wants to. So knock on wood, we're certainly hopeful that that we will not be turned away. And I will say, even if that would happen, there's a great deal of information that one can get from the road and from other sources, you know, atlases, descriptions of properties that might be in SDAT, doing a title search. It isn't just being able to walk around the building and get a photo of all 4 elevations. There's a lot more. So you know, obviously, in the perfect world, we would gain access, and that's what we're hoping. But we can get at the information many avenues, through many avenues.
You know, that brings up another question. I mean, I haven't done survey work in a very, 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 very long time. But at the time there was, and this would be in the 80s, I shouldn't be saying that to everybody, this would have been in the 80s. There was some controversy, particularly among some of the folklorists who work in the field, that if someone doesn't want their property to be surveyed, you don't even photograph it. You just completely walked away, as compared to my supervisor, who was like, you know, you try to get as many pictures as you can from the road. But I don't know if it was Dell Upton or Bernie Herman, who I should know, because one of my, these are all architectural historians, folk architectural historians, was very much, you don't even photograph it. You don't even do that if they don't want you there.
Mm-hmm. No, that's understandable, because again, their rights are paramount, and we take that into consideration. But again, I've never really been turned away. There's, you know, people are, frankly, one of the things that saves us is that people are interested in archaeology. And at some level, we seem to be able to connect, reach common ground, and have a conversation that brings us together, frankly, because we may be coming at it slightly differently, but we're interested in the same thing, which is who, what, when, where, what does this mean? How do I fit into it? And so I think we've been able to use that to, you know, to our benefit many times.
Okay, one final question, Elizabeth. And this is from Terry. How are researchers using the National Digital Newspaper Project in their research, particularly the Catoctin Clarion?
Is where our interns, and I mentioned a few of them in the presentation, are doing a deep dive into the newspapers, and they are definitely using the digital archive. And that is already bringing information that we're finding in the diaries, or that we have found from other sources. It's, you know, that information is coming to fore. Here's an example. In the diaries, in 1803, we have a gentleman from Catoctin Furnace who's been an African-American who's been accused of murder and put in the jail in Frederick. And then the newspaper in Frederick talks about, unfortunately, he was accused of this. No one knows if he was, you know, what the real story was, but he was hanged. And so we have, now we've been able to figure out who his owner was, and we're coming up with, you know, sort of filling this tragic story in, but the newspapers are a very big part of that. So all of those, you know, I always like to say, we don't give, you know, we don't give extra agency to any part of our research. It all comes together into a single mix. And then as we filter out, you know, the real story, you know, that, you know, some of the things may fall apart or may be slightly modified, but all the research has to come together in order for us to put together as complete a story as we can. And so that is where these diaries are coming in, because they're a heretofore completely unutilized, phenomenal, frankly, database.
Fabulous. And then one final thing, Elizabeth Pam McClanahan, who you don't know, is with us here and is at the University of Maryland and oversees the newspaper project. And I know she'll be very interested in touching base with you in regards to how you all are using the Catoctin Clarion, because they like that for their grant reports. So just throwing Pam out there.
Well,
So
she'll be happy to know that Kaylee Bergetson, one of our interns from the University of Maryland College Park, is using that database right now, and she has come up with some amazing things. So I can link us up, and she's a current student.
cool. Pam's also a Hood grad. Okay, that aside, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Next, we will have Carrie Albee, who you've already casually met. And Carrie will be talking to us about the survey work that she and her firm are doing in Frederick City. So thank you so much, Carrie. Carrie was I think yesterday, was it yesterday I asked you? She was very sick too.
Thursday.
See, I gave you an extra day.
All
So
right.
tell us everything we need to know.
I certainly shall. I'm trying to share my screen, so hopefully you all will see a map here shortly. Okay. Mary, can you all see that?
You're good. You're good, Carrie.
Okay. So the city of Frederick has retained Gray and Pape, the firm that I work for, to conduct a survey of buildings within the National Register Historic District Downtown Frederick, and to update and expand, if appropriate, the National Register nomination for the city. So that most of you have probably seen the nomination. The original nomination is from the 70s and was updated in 1988. And at the time, although survey forms were created for every building, we did not have obviously any of the documentation online, digital documentation tools that we can utilize now. So one of the main goals of the project was to photograph all of the resources in the district and to determine contributing and non-contributing status. And then with respect to the topics that are of particular interest in an expanded National Register nomination are LGBTQ, immigrant populations, women, and African-American population. So these are obviously the areas where traditional old school, if you will, history and architectural history did not adequately address, and that's certainly the case with the National Register nomination. So what I wanted to do is, because I know we don't have much time, is I just wanted to show you a few of the most sexy aspects of this project. So what we are doing in documenting up to 5,000 buildings in downtown Frederick is we created a GIS database for that information that will not only support the nomination, but will also be a tool that can be used by the city preservation planners, Lisa Murphy and Christina Martinkowski, as they manage and review and support property owners in downtown Frederick. So what you see here, the 1988 boundaries of the historic district, and then we have imported a bunch of existing stuff: county GIS information, city GIS information, MHT forms are linked to this database. And what you're seeing all of the GPS points that relate to a specific parcel in the city, and the green and red are properties that we have surveyed to date. And we've focused obviously in this downtown oldest area, and green represents preliminarily a contributing status, and red preliminarily a non-contributing status. So there's a lot of information there, but I just thought what I would share with you is one of the sort of avenues that we've been looking at African American history. So obviously the African American community that lives in the city of Frederick knows where the parts of the city where their grandparents, where they grew up, their grandparents lived, great grandparents. And there is a lot of anecdotal information, but one of the things we were hoping to do with this project is to actually physically link you know, through documentation, the locations of the city, and in some cases, the buildings in the city with African-American demographics, not just renting properties and living in properties, but also home ownership. And so one of the things that that we have done is we went through the 1887 Sanborn maps for the city of Frederick. And I haven't been on all day, so I don't know how much you've talked about them, but they are basically, I'm obsessed with Sanborn maps. I could spend the rest of my life looking at Sanborn maps. So the information is not consistent, but in 1887, we went around to all the maps and we highlighted the areas that specifically reference colored or Negro activities, churches, schools, and residences. And I'm just selecting this one because it's a particularly delightful building here. So this is on West South Street. North is actually to the right. And these buildings here are listed as Negro tenements, or they're recorded as Negro tenements. So these are the buildings that that remain extant, that this Sanborn map is referencing. So one of the things that this has enabled us to do is to say, okay, so these actual physical buildings, you know, we can confirm were noted as Negro tenements in 1887. And this is important, not just for the National Register nomination, but also for the city planners as they are managing, you know, proposed applications and activities within the local historic district, which this is. So, you know, knowing that aspect of the history is important. What is also interesting about what the African-American sites, residential clusters that have been identified in the 1887 Sanborn map, of all of them, they are all, every single one of them has been completely demolished either by urban renewal or other, you know, earlier than urban renewal, like housing projects, or just completely obliterated and, you know, 30s and 40s, you know, like upper class housing put there. I mean, it's crazy and heartbreaking. And this was the only building that I could confirm that was called African-American in 1887 that is still extant. Now, obviously that's not the only one, but this is, you know, where we can actually point to the documentation. So I also was just going to show you, everyone's familiar with this map, and I think that Elizabeth Comer mentioned this. So this is one of the maps that we have geo-referenced in our database, along with the 1870s maps and a selection of Sanborn maps. So as we go through and we do the research, we can actually look at layers of historic maps to determine if the buildings that we're looking at are, let's say the tax record says that they're 1890, but we're looking at, we're thinking, okay, that looks more like 1820. We can look at the historic maps to determine change over time. Obviously, we can't do this for all 5,000 buildings, but I'm particularly interested in South Street and All Saints, and the areas where there are clusters of older, more modest buildings that we don't know necessarily a lot about. So probably, you know, you can tell I could talk about this forever, but I know that we've got a lot of other people that want to talk and have things to do. So what I would say is that I look forward to updating you all on the status of this project, hopefully next year. We will actually be finished with the boots on the ground survey in March, and then we will have a draft National Register nomination May-June timeframe. Now it's, you know, obviously we can't exhaust all of these topics like we would like to do. This is a perfect example of we're getting paid a certain amount, so we have a certain budget, and I can already tell you that I have to fight rabbit holes everywhere I turn. Oh, and to that end, this is a rabbit hole that I've picked up on my own free time because I absolutely can't help myself. But what this is a spreadsheet where I have gone through the 1940 census records and written down block by block what the demographics are of that block, so that at some point we can actually show that on a map, like African-American neighborhood, immigrant neighborhood, or, and we can also start to track things like home ownership. In this particular case, 6th Street, 7th Street, North Market Street, we have 431 households, and 151 of which are owned, 5 of which are Black owned, 5 out of 431, and 279 rented. And I think that actually adds up to 435. So I have to check my math. But, and as we go through, we're making notes of the homes that are owned. You know, who is that person? Helen Dorsey in 1940, she owned her house. And we know the street address, and we can point it back to the actual house itself if it remains extant, because the 1940 census actually lists street addresses. So with that, I'll stop and not pull you all into my rabbit hole, and just thank you all for taking an interest in the project.
Thank you, Carrie. That is fabulous. At one point, I forget how long ago it was, Marilyn or Carolyn can probably tell me, for the Maryland, when we were looking at those tenements, that part of Frederick, and there certainly are advantages to doing urban survey work, because you do have sources like Sanborn maps. And it's gotten so much more exciting. I remember when I was doing survey work in Delaware, we just had these photocopies of Sanborn maps as we're walking down the streets of, you know, Bridgeville, Delaware, the home of Scrapple. Just a much different world. Thank you so much. Carrie has already agreed to come back next year and tell us the findings. And again, I cannot thank her enough for joining us on such short notice today. If anyone have any particular questions for Carrie, we have getting a lot of love in the chat about how excited they are by the research and can see utilizing it. Technology really has changed survey in a lot of very exciting ways. Okay, don't seem to be any exact questions for Carrie. Again, I'm in your debt. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thrilled to do it.
Oh, hey, Carrie, Marilyn says Paradise Alley is now the dog park area, just so you know.
Also called Devil's Half Acre.
Yes, we knew that. We knew that.
Yep. Very bizarre. And it does, another one that I'm looking at is Schwalben's Row, which is South Bent Street, just south of Patrick. And since most of those buildings remain extant, I'm looking very closely at the history of that particular area, where quote unquote swell Negro residences are recorded in the Sanborn map. So it's just absolutely irresistible stuff to learn about.
Very cool. All right, well, thank you so much. And feel free to stay for as long as you like. Our next presenter is Tracy Evans from Monocacy, who is going to give us a synopsis of the work that Monocacy has recently been doing relating to African-American history. Where are you, Tracy? I know you're out there.
Can you hear me?
I can.
All right, you just can't see me.
I can't see you. You're always a woman of mystery.
Yes, well, I'm hitting the camera, but it just wants to say more. And then it says rename.
Let me see if I can help you.
Turn it on, Mary.
I'm doing what I can.
All I have is mute and more.
Okay, we just asked you to start your video. You're getting
my video.
There we go. There
Hi.
there she is. Thank you also, Tracy, for coming out at last minute. And again, we had, for full disclosure, we were planning on another type of discussion to occur after this, but as usual, it's Master Docent, we go long. So Tracy, give us an update. What you all, and not only an update, because there's some people in our little crowd here who aren't from here or haven't been around recently and have no idea what you all are doing at Monocacy.
Yeah. All right. Hi, I am Tracy Evans. I am a ranger at Monocacy National Battlefield, actually in my ranger shirt today, which is kind of unusual because we have been closed since last March. The park itself has been open, but the visitor center has been closed, and we do not have a time just yet or date when we will open. Hopefully doing some sort of outdoor tent, perhaps by the end of April or into May. And we are located on the outskirts of Frederick City. We're about 3 miles just south of Frederick City, historic Frederick. And this was fantastic information about you know, what research is being conducted that's going on in the city, because, you know, obviously we had a lot of people who lived and worked at the battlefield who then lived in the city and vice versa. So all of this research will be helpful to us as well. Also, want to give a shout out to some volunteers that are on here. So hi guys. And so just wanted to share some information about what we have been doing at the park in terms of African American history. The Park Service, which has at times been a little delayed in the way that we've been interpreting history and keeping up with the scholarship. We're trying to get a lot better about that. And, you know, different sites are trying more and more to incorporate the Native peoples of the area into their interpretation. Obviously, many sites are based on what happened there with Native peoples. And so we're trying to do the same with Native American and African American history at the battlefield. And a lot of that was spurred on in the early 2000s by the work that was done at the Best Farm, where they did the work at what we call La Hermitage. That's what the farm was called in the late 1790s or 1790s and into the 1800s when Victoire de la Vincentière lived there. And there was an enslaved village of about 90 people in 1800. So that sort of spurred us to learn even more about the African American history at the park. Obviously, the momentum was getting started. And so a lot of what I'm going to tell you, some of that has to do with the work that was done at La Hermitage, and also us trying to learn more about the African American history in the rest of the park, and not just at the Best Farm. So if you come to the battlefield and if you look at our website, you're gonna see some pages and some information on African American history. The programming that we are doing at the park, we are trying to incorporate that. Depending on the ranger you get, you're going to get more of that than not, perhaps. But because the history of the park and the development of the park lend directly to the battle and the war, that is obviously infused into our programming, waysides, and now our exhibits. We are going to be, hopefully this year, everything will be installed into the tenant house, which is one of the historic houses over at the Thomas Farm. And we developed freestanding exhibits that will be there. They won't be manned. You'll be able to come into the building and see these exhibits that talk about the park and its history as a crossroads, economically, and transportation, but basically from, you know, early Native American period up through today. So you'll get a very varied history, and it will be inclusive of pretty much everything that went on there, condensed into exhibits that fit into the tenant house. But as we go forward, any of the exhibits that we create thus forward are going to incorporate all that. If you come into the museum upstairs, you'll find that it's really just about the day of the battle, which, you know, there's good reason for that. We are there because of the battle. But as we go forward, you know, we'll be looking at how to do the exhibits while telling the entire story, because African Americans who lived and worked on those farms, the USCT station that was at the Monocacy Junction, all of those are vital to the history of the park. So those are things that we will be incorporating as we go forward, because they are just part of the history. So the tenant house, so things that you're not gonna like see full on if you come into the park or you're on our website are some of the research that's being done or that we are trying to get done. Right now we have an ongoing ethnographic study of the park, and separately but in tandem with a descendant community outreach. Those are being done by Dr. Watkins and Dr. Cherry of American University. And they did a presentation on that, or Dr. Watkins did a presentation on that earlier this year. Some of you may have seen, presenting some of their research. So we will await the final product of that. And anytime that we have this type of work done and these studies done, all of that then is used by us It's a public document that people can read, but then it is, used by us as we start incorporating that information into programming and into waysides and into exhibits and into everything that we do at the park. Many of you are familiar with the genealogical study that was done of the Hermitage, both the enslaved population and the family who lived there. That information is still not public because they're doing outreach to the descendants themselves, and until that's complete, they are not going to make that public. But once it is public, certainly we will let people know about that. Something that we have going on this year, we will be getting an intern from the Greening Youth Foundation. And this is usually an intern that's a grad student in public history or something of this like that from a historically Black college. And we will be having this person do research specific to the USDT recruiting station. There are many things that we wanted to know about that station, exactly how long was it there, what might it have looked like, and exactly who was recruited through there. And I know that there is sort of information in different pockets by people who have been doing research throughout Frederick County. And so anyhow, we want to try to get all that together and then, try to grow from there. And also we're in the process of writing project funding for 2023. One of the things that we want to look at is this transition from enslaved labor to paid labor from 1860 to 1890 at Monocacy Junction, and how African Americans negotiated and fared during this transition, because we know that people, were still working on those properties and tenants of those properties. So that's something that we want to learn more about. So we are, as always, trying to learn more about the battlefield and the people who lived there. And I think that's it. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. If not, that's sort of what we've got going on.
Thank you much, Tracy, for that quick synopsis. We are very much in your debt, your willingness to put your fancy clothes on and to come out here today. If anybody has like one question for Tracy, we got time for one question. Tracy is easily accessible. Well, we know where to find you.
You know where to find me.
I think you're free, Tracy.
Yeah, I'm either very clear or very confused, everybody.
Very
That's
clear.
always what I say.
Very, very clear.
Yeah.
And thankfully, Barry has entered the scene, which our next presenter. Again, Tracy, thank you. As always, I am in your debt. Please let me know what I can do to make up for this situation.
Oh, no, it's fine. Thanks for letting us advertise what we're doing and get all this other great information about what's happening in the county.
Always happy to have you here. Also, before we bring Barry further onto the screen, Carrie wanted to point out that Drew Harris, who many of us know from her time as an intern with some of us, a volunteer with some of us, as an employee at Rose Hill, is on Carrie's survey team. And also, I would like to point out that the previous Frederick County Preservation Planner, Janet Davis, is with us. So whenever you look at those older superbly done forms, they were Janet's. Janet will deny it, but she really is one of the best, if not the best, surveyors in the state for quite a lengthy period of time. So now we will have Barry. Carrie, the other Carrie, my Carrie, will stop recording and then start recording again. Thank you so much for your patience. We very much are very, again, I lost my language during the pandemic. We are very grateful for your kindness and your patience. We always go long in Master Docent and it's always my fault, but thank you ever so much. Barry has managed architectural preservation, conservation, and exhibit projects over a professional career spanning 40 years. He has worked in Michigan and Alabama and retired after 32 years with the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, where he may have known my grad school roommate, Beth Hager.
Oh, yeah.
Barry won an award from MARAC, which is the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference, for his co-authored work Out in Central Pennsylvania, The History of an LGBT Community, which was released by Penn State University Press, and it was the Arlene Custer Memorial Award, which I know most of you don't know what MARAC is, but this was a big deal award. So we are very excited to have Barry with us today. Barry, do we need to you're already a co-host. Carrie has made you a co-host, so feel free to share your screen. And again, thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, thank you so much. I guess you can hear me okay?
We can hear you and we can see your screen, Barry, so you're
Okay,
good.
good. Let's see. All right, well, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in your program today. From the bio, you can guess that I have had a lot of experience working with historic sites and museums over the years. You know, the work that I did at the commission in particular was heavily involved in doing research and planning, design, construction, and preservation maintenance on historic sites and museums throughout Pennsylvania that are owned by the state, and worked on about 500 buildings there in my career. So I'm very familiar with a lot of the work that you do at historic sites and museums, and have a lot of respect for the work that you do, and I'm glad to be with you. So what I wanted to discuss today is a project that I started working on just before I left the PHNC and retired. And this has become my retirement project. It's a volunteer project, and it's something that I have a passion about, and happy to share with you information about it today. So the project started in August of 2012. I was interested in getting involved in the LGBT Center, which had just opened in Harrisburg. So I attended a couple of meetings there. They were starting up an Aging with Pride group. So I was unfortunately qualified for that category, and started attending some of the meetings. And they were looking for programming ideas to have different topics of interest to the community. So one of the things that I had been involved in back a few years before that was putting together a story circle for a youth group in the area, and got together a number of people, older people from the community, to talk about their memories and their stories and the history of the community. And so that went very well the first time I did it. So I decided that I would suggest we do it again for this other group. So it was very well received. We had probably about 25 or 30 people attend. It was a very interesting program. A lot of stories came out that I didn't know about, that I've been living in Central PA since 1983. So I didn't have as much of the early history as some other people. So it was very eye-opening for a lot of people. And we decided that it was really important that we try to figure out a way to record this history and preserve it, and make it available to the community. So we decided that we would start a history project, and we wanted to make sure that we had an oral history component to the project. We knew that that was going to be an essential part of it, and we also wanted to collect material, archival material, artifacts, and so forth from people in the community who kept some of this material. So you can see there a couple of our presenters from the first oral history, the first story circle that we did. Well, as luck would have it, there were two people who had just gotten also involved in the LGBT Center with another group that had heard about what we were doing, and sort of showed up on my doorstep, if you will, looking to get involved. And one was Amy Skillman, who is currently the director of the graduate program at Goucher College in Baltimore in cultural sustainability. and the other Dr. Lana Malmsheimer, who is Professor Emerita and was the head of the American Studies program at Dickinson College in Carlisle, both of whom had extensive experience in oral history, both in the practice of oral history, also in the training of oral history. So it was an incredibly valuable gift to the program, to the project, that these two women stepped up and were willing to pro bono provide all of their expertise and their services. So that was really a great opportunity for us. So just to share with you our mission is to engage people to discover, document, collect, preserve, and present the history of the LGBTQ community in Central Pennsylvania through oral histories and material culture. And all 5 of those elements I'm going to talk about through my presentation, and all really are very important and critical to the success of our project, and I think to the success of any kind of project like this. Throughout the presentation, you're going to see a lot of images of historical photos that we've collected from the community, artifacts and documents. So if there's any, I'll try to narrate a little bit about what things are as we go through too, just so that you can get a sense of what significance that some of those have. And by the way, anybody who has questions along the way, please feel free to put them in the chat as they occur to you, and we'll try to deal with them at the end of the presentation. So we started collecting material from the community. I was fortunate to know a lot of people who were involved early on in the history of the development of the community in Central PA. So I started through word of mouth and through some initial publicity through the LGBT Center. We were able to reach out to a lot of people and start receiving collections. So we've been collecting historical photographs and personal papers of individuals, as well as archival documents from the various LGBTQ organizations that existed over a number of years, as well as a number of the artifacts that are kind of typical of activism communities, like t-shirts, buttons, pins, flags, signs, and various other kinds of material. And you can see a few examples there on the screen. That one, by the way, on the lower left is the first ever LGBTQ protest demonstration in Harrisburg, or in anywhere in Central PA, in 1977. We knew from the beginning that it would be really impossible for us to properly deal with a collection. We didn't have the facilities with the LGBT Center. We didn't have a professional archivist on staff there. I wasn't going to be able to really serve in that capacity because my training is not really in archival work. So fortunately, with the contact that we developed with Dr. Lana Malmsheimer, who was at Dickinson, she suggested that the Dickinson archives may be someplace that we want to think about. And so she set up a meeting with the staff there, and they were incredibly generous and were incredibly excited about working with us and making the archives the repository of all the collection that we were going to be putting together. And they may be regretting that at some point, because we are now the fastest growing collection in the archives. We're also the most used collection in the archives, but they are actually very supportive and very pleased to have the collection there. So they are really able to provide us with the professional archival care. They do all the cataloging, describing, and arranging of the collections. They provide, of course, the storage and great access to researchers. Being a college, they have pretty good hours and availability. and they have a great facility there, a great reading room, research room. And then they've also provided us with opportunities to collaborate on exhibits, original research, and publications, and also great access to students and professors who are interested in what we're doing. Again, some images down at the bottom there. The lower left image is actually the first gay publication in central Pennsylvania, which started in 1974. So discovery is an important part of our mission, trying to find the materials that tell the stories about the history, as well as finding the people who are willing to be interviewed, the narrators, to be interviewed for oral history recordings. So through our research, through our outreach efforts, rather, we're able to find quite a lot of people. We were very surprised at the interest that there was initially at the project. I was expecting a lot of hesitancy of people to be willing to share their stories and be recorded and documented, but we actually had a tremendous outreach, or tremendous amount of response to our outreach, and quickly had more than 100 people on the waiting list to be interviewed. We were able to do the outreach through a number of means, and it was important that we did that because our community is not monolithic. They get their information from a lot of different sources. So we were able to participate in a lot of LGBTQ events, like the lower right picture, which is one of the Pride festivals in central Pennsylvania. We set up information tables and did signups there. We did publicity through various mainstream media, gay media, as well as the social media, and then also just word of mouth. As people heard about the project, they would tell their friends, and we got a lot of referrals from other people who got involved initially. We also got a lot of volunteers right off the bat too. We ended up with about 25 or 30 volunteers that signed up through various events. And so we soon had enough that we were able to start a training program. So with the video, or with the oral history interviews, we decided that we wanted to capture those and record those on video as much as possible. We have a few that were done on audio only recording equipment, but the majority of people were willing to do video, and I think that was a real benefit to the project, because now we have hundreds of hours of video, which are going to be useful not only for researchers, but also for people who want to do sort of documentary type programs and things like that. And so we created a list of interested narrators to be interviewed. We also created I'll call it a questionnaire, but it's really more of a series of prompts and categories of information that we wanted to have as standard talking points or question points. We wanted to give the interviewers some flexibility and the ability to create their own questions, to tailor the questions to the specific person who was being interviewed. And so we gave them some leeway in being able to do that. But we wanted to follow kind of a standard format so that the interviews had similar kinds of themes and topics. So we developed a oral history training program with the help of Amy and Lana. They were our primary trainers for the first, I'd say 2 or 3 years, at least, of the project. Amy left, I guess, about that point to go to Goucher College full-time. And then we conducted video oral history interviews with people in the community who had signed up. Like I said, we had about 100 on the waiting list, so it took us quite a while to get through that. We also prepared text transcriptions of all of the interviews. And there's a couple of photos there of our initial training program that we had, the first training program with our volunteers. So in addition to the documentation part of the process, the presenting of material, I think, is a very important part, because it's a way that we really connect with our community. People want to see what's been collected. They want to see who have been interviewed, and start learning about some of this history through programming. So we started an annual exhibit series almost from the beginning of the project, which was held at Dickinson College's archives and library, called History Comes Out. It was held every October since 2013, except for this last year, which of course with the problem with COVID, we were unable to do it for the first time, but we're hoping to be able to do it again this fall. October, of course, is LGBT History Month, so we tried to have some program in conjunction with that month every year. We also do a number of pop-up exhibits, special exhibits for other venues, and we also have a permanent showcase that we keep at the LGBT Center in Harrisburg for rotating exhibits, particularly for things that are new to the collection. We try to showcase items that have just been donated, and also let people know about certain special events through various kinds of special exhibits there that are thematic and time of year seasonal. We also created a series of exhibits which were utilizing both art and history as the focus. And we did 3 exhibits, which were the retrospective exhibits on the career of a particular well-known artist in the community. In this case, an example of one that we did, which was for Paul Foltz, who had been a costume designer, or is still a costume designer, working with Theater Harrisburg primarily, but then also with a number of other theater companies throughout Central PA for more than 40 years. And he also had started a drag troupe in Central Pennsylvania called Lily White and Company. And so we also, you'll see in a minute, we did a coordinating exhibit, or exhibit just down the street from this one at the same time. So this was held at the Historic Harrisburg Resource Center. They were a great partner with us. We exhibited about 35 costumes from Paul's career. We also exhibited the original sketches. You can see a couple of his sketches there, as well as historical photographs from some of the shows that the costumes were used in, and then some narrative text and interpretation. And we also did a day in the life of Paul Foltz, where we sort of followed him around with a professional cameraman to document kind of the process of work that he does in terms of design and planning and you know, the actual production of the costumes, the detail, all the different aspects of the work that he does. So we did a photographic essay on a number of exhibit boards that were part of the exhibit as well. And this was the other part of that exhibit, which was an exhibit of photographs by Jack Radcliffe, who was actually from Maryland. And some of you may know his work. And Jack did a series of photographs of Lily White and Company, the drag troupe that Paul founded. These were, and you can see his photographs down at the bottom there. These are all photographs of performers in that troupe that they were photographed as they were getting ready for a fundraiser for an organization, a gay organization, AIDS organization, I should say, in York, that Jack was also there to photograph. And you can see the top photo there is a photo of the actual exhibit of his photographs in the LGBT Center in Harrisburg. Here's another example of one of those retrospective exhibits. Jude Sharp, who was a jewelry designer in Lancaster, who has been working for more than 40 years in that field. And we did a photographic exhibit of her jewelry designs and production. And also, again, a day in the life kind of exhibit. Two of those photographs at the top are from where she demonstrated a number of processes that she uses in her work. And then we also did a series of art and history exhibits partnering with local art organizations, museums, and we invited artists to do a new work that was inspired by some part of our collection, whether it was a historical photograph or an oral history or a document or some artifact. So we got a great response, people from not just Pennsylvania, but out of state as well. And we exhibited the resulting show at the Susquehanna Art Museum and also the Lancaster Museum of Art. And then the Art Association of Harrisburg also did a separate show inviting their members to similarly contribute a piece that was inspired by something from our collection. We've done some collaborative exhibits in history as well. This one is with the State Museum and Archives in Harrisburg. It's a exhibit of photographs, historical photographs and documents, and a few artifacts, which dealt with Governor Milton Schaap's initiatives in LGBTQ rights in the 1970s. Governor Schaap was quite ahead of his time when it comes to LGBTQ rights, way ahead of the other governors in the other states. He issued the first executive order in 1975 to ban discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation for all state employees. That was the first state to do that. California was next in 1978, 3 years later. And then he also initiated another executive order which set up a state body called the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities. And that was the first ever governmental body created in this country that dealt with LGBTQ civil rights and public policy. So it was, again, quite ahead of its time. And also he initiated a proclamation for Gay Pride Week in 1976, which again was the first governor, I believe, of any state to do that. In conjunction with the exhibit, we had a symposium in the State Museum Auditorium, which was celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities. We had original members from the organization that came back, we were able to find and came back and did a presentation about what their role was and what kinds of things the council did in its about 10-year history. And we recorded it, so it's basically like a group oral history presentation. And or rather Mark Siegel there in the right is one of the participants, and he was actually the gay activist that initiated a meeting with Governor Schaap in 1974 that led to all of these initiatives that Governor Schaap made. So we also have been working with what's called the Pennsylvania LGBT History Network, which I started with a few other people to begin working with other institutions around the state that have LGBTQ collections or have some interest in developing collections or interest in the topic of LGBTQ history in general. We now have more than 100 members of that organization or that network. So there's been a growth in the awareness and the interest of LGBT history in the state. This is an example of a traveling exhibit that we did as a collaborative project. Several of the organizations and institutions that are represented in that network came together to do the research and script writing and selecting and finding images, and then we had a designer do a project to design the project and also fabricate the exhibit for us. And it's a really good format for us, I think, because it's a very easy exhibit to set up and transport and take down. This particular exhibit premiered at the Pennsylvania State Capitol, and it's traveled to 50 different venues around Pennsylvania, everything from libraries to colleges and universities, a few high schools, and some older adult living centers, and a few other different kinds of venues, museums, and so forth. This is another example. This is our second traveling exhibit that we've done, which is an exhibit that deals with the LGBTQ Cuban refugees that came during the Mariel boat lift in 1980. And the reason why we had an interest in this topic is because Fort Indiantown Gap in central Pennsylvania was one of the centers that processed the refugees for resettlement. And there were a large group of LGBTQ refugees that came through Fort Indiantown Gap. In fact, that photograph you see on the left is at the Gap. At the time, it was caused quite a stir to people in central Pennsylvania to see that there was a lot of, Cuban refugees in general, but also gay Cuban refugees in particular. So it was a big story for a short time in central PA, but it's a story that I think has been forgotten over 40 years. And so we wanted to retell that story, talk about the experience of the refugees coming from their home in Cuba, through the boat lift, through Florida and coming up to the Gap, and then also being resettled in various places and what their life was like since then. We did some oral histories as part of this project, and we also incorporated some video screens in the exhibit that were able to show clips from those oral histories, including at least 2 or 3 of the refugees, and then also people who helped with the resettlement process, and also people who had documented this story at the time when it came out. We also started getting into publications, and Mary mentioned our book out in central Pennsylvania, which has just come out this year, or this past year. We decided that although our project isn't finished, I don't think it'll ever be finished, we did feel we had enough material to really tell the essential story of the development of the community in central Pennsylvania. And there are not a lot of books that have been written about LGBTQ history in rural areas of the country and small cities and places like central PA. So we felt that it was an area of study that needed to be documented, and a publication would be a useful way to do that. And some books have been written that are more focused on the individual experiences of people coming out in rural areas, but our book, which does talk about that as well, but also focuses more on how does a community actually develop and mature over time, how do institutions and organizations develop in a place that is more rural than in a place like Philadelphia, for example, or New York City. So, that's been a rewarding project to put that book together. We also have developed digital content as a result of the project, and we have guides to our collections online. We have oral history transcripts online. Most of our oral history videos are also up on YouTube. We also have done a Google Maps database, which you can see a copy there, a screenshot of there below, where we've mapped the location of LGBTQ history in central PA. We have more than 600 locations that were mapped. All of this material, or all this information, was culled out of the collection that we've developed. Any time that there was a reference to a specific address, location, we were able to pull that into a database and then pull that onto a map. We also developed a Flickr album of about 400 photos of items in the collection, just to get people some sense of what we have. Doesn't substitute for a more formal collections digitization project, which we are actually just started working on back in July. We were fortunate to get a couple of grants that helped with that, and so we are now fully into a full collections digitization project. Developing all the metadata and doing good scans and good photographs of documents and other collection items. And that project's going to continue on for at least another year, year and a half, and we're hoping even further than that. I mentioned earlier about interns. We've been extremely lucky to get a lot of very gifted interns working with us from not only Dickinson College, but also other colleges and universities throughout central PA. And some have done original research for us. They've transcribed oral history interviews. A few have even conducted oral history interviews after going through our training program. And also some have created their own mini videos, mini documentary type videos, curated exhibits for us, and created some digital exhibits as well. So we've had a great advantage in having students involved in the project. Here's just some examples. We've got a few digital exhibits currently up on the web, and we are adding more all the time. In fact, there's one that's been added just since I put this slide together on discrimination, stories of discrimination. And we also have one on the history of the bars in central Pennsylvania, and that will be coming up soon. Just to give you kind of a sense of some of the stories that we're finding in central PA, we discovered this organization called the Pennsylvania Rural Gay Caucus, which started in 1975 and actually grew out of the efforts, the meetings that were held leading up to the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities, the Governor Schaap appointed, a lot of people were coming to those meetings who were from the rural parts of the state. And they didn't know each other, but they started getting to know each other at the meetings and after the meetings. And so they decided to form this nonprofit coalition, if you will, of a lot of small organizations and individuals around the state from various small cities and towns. So this caucus was able to accomplish quite a bit as a group versus what each individual small organization couldn't do individually. And so there was a conference, annual conference that they put together every year for about 5 or 6 years that brought together people from all over the state to have workshops and learn basically various issues around activism and civil rights and so forth. And the photograph on the right is one of the meetings of the group that was held in Wilkes-Barre. They traveled their meetings around the state to make it easy for all the different organizations involved. The caucus also had the first gay lobby day in the state, which was in 1976. So it was the first attempt to lobby the state legislature to pass non-discrimination laws and other protections for LGBTQ people. Unfortunately, it was not successful, and unfortunately, it hasn't been successful ever since. But we continue to try in Pennsylvania to get our legislature to be a little bit more enlightened in this issue. Then we also had, the group also marched in the Gay Pride Parade in Philadelphia in 1976. That was the first time that they made an appearance and was the one of the first Pride events in the state. By the way, we have, not only do we have that photograph of their contingent marching with their banner, but we have their actual banner in the collection, which I think is just incredible. The caucus also organized a number of protest events throughout the state and demonstrations. This one was from the Bloomsburg Fair, where Anita Bryant, who was a beauty queen turned gospel singer, for those of you who don't know her, turned anti-gay activist. And so she was appearing there for a performance at the Bloomsburg Fair in 1978. And there's a photograph there on the left of the protest march that happened at the fairgrounds. What was pretty significant about that was that there were about 30 protesters and about 5,000 to 10,000 people in the stands who were very hostile and very ended up coming down onto the track and almost assaulting the marchers around the oval. The state police initially were there as an escort for the group, but they quickly disappeared. So the protesters did make it around okay, and they actually had a rally nearby in a park. They had a number of speakers, and one of the speakers, Dan Manival from Williamsport, who was a young activist at the time, he spoke at the rally, and he also then went home to encounter people from his neighborhood who were not really happy about his appearance on television and what he was talking about. And his home was extensively vandalized over a period of weeks and months, to the point where he had to sell his house and move out of town because it was getting that dangerous for him to live there. So we document stories like that. We have oral histories of Dan and many of the other people who marched in this event, as well as other similar kinds of stories of discrimination documented through the oral history process. Another example of a story we've found through the project was the York House Hospice, which was one of the first AIDS hospices in the country. Joy Euphema Council, who was is actually pretty well known throughout the world as kind of the founder of the hospice care concept. She was the first nurse that was trained in that field. She worked at Harrisburg Hospital in the beginning of her career, and that's a photograph of her down in the lower left corner. And then above are photographs of patients who were cared for at the hospice that Joy founded in 1990. And you can see a sketch of the exterior of the building. She was able to get the city to give her the building for $1, and then she got a lot of volunteer labor to renovate the building and then turn it into a really wonderful place for people to spend their last days and months. So the photographs above, again, Jack Radcliffe took those. He was involved, they were actually taken for a show at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington for a photographic exhibit that was then became a traveling show and went around to, gosh, I think probably dozens, if not more than that, galleries and museums around the country, and I think a couple around or overseas as well. So it was a major show. This was the only AIDS hospice documented in the exhibit. So the collection has grown rapidly. We have now more than 150 oral history interviews with transcriptions. We have probably now by this time about 120 cubic feet of archival documents and artifacts. You can see again just some items there from our collection. We did win the 2014 J. Franklin Jameson Award for Archival Advocacy from the Society of American Archivists. So we're very proud of that recognition. And even though it was actually fairly early in our project, I think we've tried to live up to that award ever since, and trying to do as good work as possible with this project. So in applying our model, we've actually had a lot of people consult with us over the years because they are interested in doing a project in a rural community or rural area similar to Central Pennsylvania. And I think your part of the state kind of fits that model as well. I don't know if you have enough interest down there to try to do your own project, but if you do, I certainly would be willing to assist in any way possible in consulting with you. We just to kind of share our thoughts about how to apply it in another place. The first thing I think is making an institutional commitment to including LGBTQ history in collections and programming. It's important to really have the institutional buy-in to that, as well as buy-in of staff and people who are involved in the institution. You'll want to find and partner with local LGBTQ community organizations that are pretty well established, who have the connections with the LGBTQ people in the area as sources of history and sources of volunteers and sources of, just really support. And you want to seek out the services of oral historians if you don't already have them on your staff or have access to them in any way. That was key to having a good project here, I think, because we wanted to make sure that our volunteers were well trained, they were well versed in the proper practice of oral history. And then you want to find a dedicated and passionate leader for the project. You know, I've been a strong and certainly full of passion leader of this project. I've pushed and pushed, and some people probably think that I work a little bit too much on it. But since this is really my full-time retirement project, I've been able to spend a lot of effort in making sure that things are able to happen, and that we are able to find resources and able to do what we want to accomplish. And then provide plenty of opportunities for the community to see the history being collected through programming, exhibits, online digital presence, whatever you can do to make sure that it gets in front of the eyeballs of all of the LGBTQ community, so that you continue to get support and continue to get interest in what you're doing. So that's my presentation. I would be happy to answer questions. The information there on the screen is how you get in touch with me if you need to follow up and ask questions later. Let's see if I can stop my screen at this point. Stop sharing. There.
Fabulous, good. Thank you so much, Barry. We do have some questions, so let me make my way through those. First of all, is there an outgrow the repository plan in case you fill up Dickinson to too great an extent?
That is a very good question. Yes, we are looking at that right now. We actually have recently partnered with the York County Heritage organization. And they have taken a few of our larger artifacts that we could not store at Dickinson College. And they took artifacts that are related to York County. And we are looking now at the possibility of partnering with other local historical societies and organizations to possibly take larger artifacts related to other counties and so forth around the area. So yeah, it's a concern that we need to start planning long term, because some of this material is coming out of the woodwork, and we are fortunately able to find it.
That's exciting. Is the collection at Dickinson, and don't tell Jim Grenzer I asked this, is it permanent or is it on like long-term loan? I mean, the stuff that's at Dickinson, it will stay at Dickinson no matter what?
Well, it will stay at Dickinson as long as Dickinson continues to want it there, and as long as we continue to want it there. It's technically it's owned by the LGBT Center organization, but it's basically on permanent, loan, if you will, permanent depository there.
So if one day, 50, 100 years from now, 10 years from now, you actually got some huge funding and had your own heritage center, Dickinson would release it?
Yes.
Do you know, you said it was the most heavily used collection, which I find very exciting, as I'm sure they do as well. Do we know who the users are?
Yeah, it's a lot of students, it's a lot of professors, and it's some outside researchers, as well as just our community, our center, because we are pulling collections all the time for exhibits and programs, things like that. So yeah, not as much in the last year, obviously, but over the course of the 8 years, yeah, quite a bit.
Do you know, from in regards to the professors, I always find it interesting, how collections are utilized, and those of us who oversee collections, either two-dimensional, three-dimensional, we're always intrigued by those people who use the collections that we never think would possibly use the collection. Do you know who some of these professors are? I'm assuming they're not just coming from local history.
Right. It's history, it's American studies, it's English, it's LGBTQ or women and gender studies, basically.
Fascinating. Okay, our next question, those other questions, well, the first question wasn't mine, but those interspersed questions were,
Sure.
Is there sources of information regarding the LGBT community pre-1950s? If so, what kinds of materials are available?
So far, we've not found anything pre-1950s, other than we do have, technically, I guess you could say that we have one item in the collection that is, it's the first, considered the first published gay novel in America, which was written by Bayard Taylor, who was from Westchester. No, not Westchester. He's from down in Southeast Pennsylvania. I'm trying to think of the name of the town. But anyway, he wrote a novel called Joseph and His Friend, A Story of Pennsylvania. And so it was a novel that he wrote that was based on a male couple that he knew at the time. And this was back in, I think it's published in 1876, something around there.
Fabulous.
Yeah. So that's the only item that we have in the collection that is LGBTQ prior to, I'd say, around 1960-ish. We do know from oral history that the Clock Bar in Harrisburg was the first gay bar that opened in central Pennsylvania, which opened in 1938. And from the best that we've been able to find so far, I've been talking to the granddaughter of the owner of the bar. She, from her recollections, she believes that it was pretty much always a gay bar from the beginning. So even though it may have been opened initially as just a general bar, a lot of gay people ended up going to the bar when it first opened, and it kind of stuck as a gay bar from then on.
Okay, this question, you've covered a little aspect of it, but it bears repeating. So how available are the transcriptions from the oral history projects, and how do you consider privacy concerns for the interviews?
Mm-hmm. So with the interviews, we have a consent form that we have every interviewee or narrator read and sign at the beginning of the interview. Or actually we have them sign it at the end of the interview after they realize what they've told on tape. We also ask them at the beginning that if we have their permission to record the interview, so that that we have that permission as well. They have an ability on the form to restrict information from the interview if they wish. And if they're donating materials to the collection, we have a gift of deed form that similarly they can restrict access if they wish to any of the items that they're donating. Fortunately, we've only had, I think, I would say 2 or 3 interviews that have been restricted out of 150, which is pretty amazing when you consider that LGBTQ people, what they've gone through over the years in terms of discrimination and bias and so forth. So I think that's been a pretty amazing record. And then a few have restricted to simply that they want to know what the interview is going to be used for in advance. So in those cases, we contact them in advance and ask them if we can use like a segment of the interview on an exhibit or whatever purpose we're going to be using it for, or if we wanted to put it up on the web, for example. There's been a few that have asked that we not do that. So the majority of our interviews are on the web, the transcripts are on the web, except the ones that have been restricted.
Do you have a kind of a generational cross section in regards to your interviews? Do they tend to fall in particular, like it's mostly people over 45, or you have a lot of people who are over 20 being interviewed or?
Well, we initially were targeting older members of the community simply because of demographics and life. We were afraid that we'd start losing people. And in fact, we did lose a couple of people that we really wanted to interview. And unfortunately, we just couldn't get to them in time. Initially it was very skewed toward the over 50 crowd. In more recent times, we've started getting younger people interviewed as well. So we have some as young as in their 20s and then all the way up to, their 80s. We also have, we've been trying to get more people of color interviewed. It's been difficult because back in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, when a lot of this history was being created, the people of color communities were not as well represented in the organizations and in the bars and in the other events and so forth, the story of the community. And so finding those people willing to share their stories has been difficult, just to be honest. So we have gotten some younger people that are stepping forward to talk about their stories, which is helpful. We're also trying to diversify and get more transgender people represented in the interviews. And we have gotten some success with that. We actually interviewed Dr. Rachel Levine. For those of you who know her, she was the Pennsylvania Secretary of Health, the highest ranking transgender person in a cabinet position in Pennsylvania, who just took a job with the Biden administration as the Assistant Secretary of Health in Biden's cabinet.
Do you have, I mean, I know that they may not have as many stories yet, but do you have, or have you had anyone under 18 come to you to be interviewed? And if so, would you interview them without parental consent, but then would you necessarily with all of them want to get parental consent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, we haven't so far had that situation. I would feel a little uncomfortable interviewing someone under 18 without parental consent. And so I think we'd have to look at that situation as it comes up and make some determination.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, next question. Pennsylvania's Heartland connotates the Amish country for our questioner, which is Lynn. What investigation or inquiry has been made into that, your laugh, into that society?
That's a very good question. It's actually one that I've been trying to figure out a way into. And I thought I had a way into it because there is a gay artist in Lancaster who is formerly a member of the Amish community, who now is a member of the Mennonite sect. But he comes from an Amish family. And he left the order. So I have been trying to get him to tell his story through an oral history, and unfortunately, so far, he's not been willing to do that. I've yet to be able to track down another possible candidate to be interviewed. I did find a website that talks about some stories of people who are Amish, who are gay or lesbian or transgender, but they're pretty anonymous stories. They don't, if they share their name, they don't share how to get in touch with them. So anyway.
Yeah, I can't say I'm stunned.
Yeah, it's a tough community to get into as a researcher or whatever.
Yeah, I would think it's a tough community to get into as any type of researcher.
Yeah.
In many ways. Okay, several organizations for Asian refugees in PA have organized their resettlement. From Asian colleagues, I've learned that LGBT is quite challenging for Asians, of course, a generalization. Are many Asian refugees found to be found in the LGBTQ community?
Well, I would say that there's some. Certainly, I've seen some involvement in a few organizations and in social settings and so forth, but it's a very, very small number, I would say, that I've noticed. We trying to think if we have any in the collection. I can't really think of anyone from the Asian community who's been interviewed, and I don't know about any other collection items that have any related information. But so it's a community that we certainly should have represented. It's just a matter of, again, finding people who are willing to share those stories.
Not getting into the inroad. Okay, Terry is curious about any similar projects or efforts in Central PA's Franklin, Adam, or Bedford counties. Is Wilson College, the traditional women's college in Chambersburg, involved in any way?
Those other counties that he mentioned, I don't think there's any specific project going on in those counties, but they're definitely counties that we initially, when we started the project, we were going to restrict it to sort of the South Central Pennsylvania area around Harrisburg, where the LGBT Center has more of their service area. But what we found was that there was literally nothing out in any other parts of the state other than Philadelphia and Pittsburgh that were documenting this LGBTQ history. So we've been expanding our geographic boundaries, as much as we can to try to encompass as much of this history as we can and collect it and document it. So we're certainly not averse to expanding into that part of the state as well. Wilson College specifically hasn't been involved. I did make a contact to reach out to them once, but I didn't get really much of a response yet. But I'm hopeful that we'll get some in the future.
Yeah, I would think, particularly with, this is so close to so many people who are doing this project, you're not going to stop at the border and say, no, we're not going to collect there, because we don't care what happens to those things. Yeah.
Right, and especially with the stories that we're getting with like the Pennsylvania Rural Gay Caucus, people were coming from up toward Erie and Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, those areas, the state Allentown. So the story is all interrelated, and you need to be able to pull together really a lot of material.
Yeah.
And just as a follow-up to Wilson College, I also just want to mention that our next collaborative traveling exhibit project is going to be called Out on Campus, which is going to document the early history of campus organizing for LGBTQ equality in Pennsylvania. And we're going to be looking at trying to research and develop the stories of especially some of the earlier organizing attempts in the 70s and 80s. So Wilson may have a story that we need to document. We don't know.
Okay, next question. Barry, do you or any in your organization have any experience preparing docents to share LGBTQ history in ongoing programs, exhibits, inclusive approaches to the general history of the area, to the focus of the museum's mission? So a museum where, if I'm reading Liz correctly, a museum where this is not the natural focus. So integrating these stories into the broader stories of the museums. If this isn't what you meant, Liz, I'm sorry, but it's.
I've not had any experience in doing that. There is a woman, Susan Ferentinos, I think, who wrote a book about incorporating gay history into historic sites. And she works, she's done a lot of work in with the National Park Service and some other places. So I'd recommend her as maybe someone to talk to about that whole issue, because I don't know enough about how you would well, you'd have to start with doing some research, I guess, on your site as to what, you know, history was there, if any, that you could incorporate into the docent narratives and interpretation. But you know, beyond that, I don't know too much about what to do.
For post clarification, what Liz was asking, a museum that has a broad mission but hasn't included this in the past. So someone who's doing, you know, the history of an entire area, or even a collegiate. So thank you for that. Okay. Did you take Dr. Levine's interview pre or post appointment, or pre or post start of the pandemic?
I took it pre-appointment as the Biden administration, but also she had been appointed by the governor at that point to be this the physician general of Pennsylvania, and it was before she became Secretary of Health, and it was before the pandemic. So it really would be good to update her story at this point with the kind of a addendum interview, but I've not pursued that because she's obviously extremely busy now.
Priorities. Terry just wants you to know, she's an alumni of Wilson College. Definitely will have multiple stories.
Oh, great. Yeah, well, certainly we look forward to trying to ferret those out.
And then Deanna wanted you to know that she attended Dickinson in the mid to late 1980s when her gay and lesbians at Dickinson Club was endlessly and openly harassed. So this has been completely delightful.
Oh, good.
As it has.
Glad that things have changed since she went there.
Okay, I think that is all of the questions, unless somebody else has one. I don't think anyone does. Thank you ever so much, Barry. We so much appreciate your taking the time to put us into your schedule. This is obviously a very important aspect of all of our communities that so many of us have not done nothing to document, or aren't even sure how to begin that documentation. And I know from my perspective as a librarian and archivist, I occasionally do get people coming in, and my collection, you know, has some things. You can always find something, but we have a huge gap. So thank you so much for sharing this, and hopefully we will be able to start filling that gap, and we may be back in touch.
Great,
So
thank you.
thank you so much.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Also, fascinating presentation, Stephanie says. Oh, and Barry's book is available, and the circulating collection of Frederick County Public Libraries available these days at curbside pickup. So
Very good.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.